The phone rang at 2:14 in the morning. Zuri Bellamy was on her knees in the east corridor, scrubbing a rust-colored stain from the baseboards. When the vibration rattled against the marble floor loud enough to make her flinch, she already knew who it was. She had known all evening, the same way a person knows a storm is coming before the first crack of thunder. Something in the air, something low and wrong pressing against the chest. She picked up. $20,000. Cormac Rourke didn't say hello. He never did. "You've got 60 minutes." Zuri pressed her back against the wall. "Cormac, I told you I need 2 more weeks. The paycheck clears on the 15th and I can give you half. There's a man sitting outside your brother's room right now." Cormac's voice stayed flat, almost pleasant, the way a person sounds when they've already made their decision and are just informing you of it. "Room 414, Providence Medical." "Nice boy, you're Isaiah. 19 years old, terrible thing, leukemia." The cleaning rag dropped from Zuri's hand. "You bring me my money in 60 minutes, Cormac said, "or that boy has himself a medical accident. Heart stops. Monitor malfunctions. These things happen in hospitals all the time. Terrible, really. If you've ever felt completely powerless, if you've ever loved someone so much that a single phone call could bring you to your knees, then you already know exactly what Zuri felt in that moment. And you have to ask yourself, what would you do? How far would you go? And what would happen if the only person who could help you was the most dangerous man you'd ever been afraid of? Before you find out, if this kind of story reaches somewhere deep inside you, please subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that hallway, because something is about to happen that will change everything. The cleaning rag lay crumpled against the baseboard, and Zuri couldn't move. That was the thing nobody ever told you about pure fear. It didn't make you run. It nailed you in place. It turned your legs into something decorative while your brain went completely white. Room 414. She knew that room better than she knew her own apartment. She knew the way the afternoon light came through the window at a slant and fell across Isaiah's left shoulder when he was sleeping. She knew the sound of his particular laugh. Slightly too loud, always surprised at itself, like he couldn't believe something had actually been funny. She knew the specific squeak of the third wheel on his IV pole, which always needed adjusting and never stayed adjusted, and which Isaiah had named Gerald for reasons he refused to explain. She pressed the phone harder against her ear. "Please." The word came out wrecked, nothing like how she'd intended. "Cormac, please. I'll get the money. 60 minutes started when I dialed." The line went dead. Zuri didn't scream. She had learned, over 9 months inside this mansion, that screaming was a luxury she couldn't afford. This house had rules that nobody wrote down because they didn't need to. You cleaned everything. You asked nothing. You made yourself small enough that the wrong people stopped seeing you. She pressed both hands over her mouth and folded slowly until her back hit the wall and her knees hit the floor, and she was sitting in the corridor with a dead phone and a cleaning rag, and 60 minutes before her brother stopped breathing. $20,000. She had $1,140 in her checking account. She had $312 in a coffee tin above her refrigerator at home, which she had been calling her emergency fund until she realized that emergency had been her permanent address for the last 2 years. She had a broken watch her mother left her that a pawn shop once offered $40 for, which she'd refused because she wasn't that desperate yet. She was now significantly past that desperate. The mansion was quiet around her. This floor belonged to Seo Tae-jin's private quarters, and at this hour, that meant it belonged to nobody. The guards rotated past every 40 minutes. The household staff had finished their evening duties and gone to their quarters. The only reason Zuri was still here at 2 in the morning was because Tae-jin's head of security, a compact, humorless man named Pak, had told her that afternoon that someone had tracked mud from the private garden entrance all the way to the east corridor, and it needed to be dealt with before morning or Pak would deal with it himself. And when Pak said things like that, everyone moved quickly. She had been scrubbing baseboards for 40 minutes. She had $1,100. And now she had less than 60 minutes. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone when it lit up again. She thought it was Cormac. She almost didn't answer, but the number was the hospital. "Miss Bellamy?" The nurse's voice was careful, professionally neutral in the way medical voices became when delivering news. I just wanted to let you know that a gentleman arrived about 20 minutes ago asking about your brother's status. He said he was family, but Isaiah doesn't have you listed as having a brother, and don't let him near that room. Zuri's voice cracked in half. Please, call security. Do not let that man anywhere near my brother. A pause. Miss Bellamy, are you? Please. That word again, broken both times. Please call security right now and don't let anyone in that room who isn't a doctor or a nurse on shift. Please. She could hear the nurse saying something about hospital policy and proper channels. And she understood that the woman was trying, that she wasn't indifferent, but proper channels took time. And time was the one thing Zuri had run completely out of. She ended the call and sat in the hallway and tried to think. There was no thinking. There was only the image of Isaiah, thin now, thinner than she'd ever seen him, his face carrying that particular exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could fix. He had started leukemia treatments at 17. He had spent his 18th birthday hooked to a drip line. He had turned 19 in a hospital bed 3 months ago and called Zuri from his room to say the cake was actually pretty good and she shouldn't worry so much, and that he'd heard the experimental protocol was showing early results. And did she think that meant something? She had said yes. She had said of course it means something. She had hung up and sat in her car in the hospital parking garage and shook for 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She had borrowed $40,000 from Cormac Rourke to fund the first 6 months of that protocol. She had already paid back $22,000 of it. The remaining 18 plus Cormac's interest calculation had somehow become $20,000, and now $20,000 stood between her brother and a man sitting outside room 414 with instructions. Zuri pressed her fist against her mouth to keep the sound inside. That was when she heard it, the door. Not loud. A quiet sound, controlled. The kind of door opened by someone who had trained himself to move through spaces without announcing his presence. The light from the office spilled into the corridor in a narrow strip, and Zuri looked up and Seo Tae-jin was standing in his doorway looking down at her. She had worked in this mansion for 9 months and exchanged maybe 60 words with the man who owned it. She had cleaned his floors, polished the glass on his bookshelves, pressed herself against walls when he walked past, and kept her eyes at floor level the way everyone else did. She had developed a mental catalog of the things she knew about him by proximity. He worked until 3 in the morning on average. He drank his coffee black and didn't touch it once it went cold. He wore the same expensive watch every day, and his silence was a different category of silence than other men's, but not empty, but actively weighted, like it was making decisions without him. She had never looked directly at his face before. Not really. He was looking directly at hers. "Get up," he said. Not cruelly. Just a statement of what needed to happen. Zuri couldn't. Her legs weren't working. She was aware of how she must look. On the floor, both hands over her face, cleaning supplies scattered around her, barely holding herself together. And she felt the hot sting of humiliation layered over everything else. Because of all the people in this house to fall apart in front of, she had chosen the one person whose opinion of her most directly determined whether she continued to have a job. "I'm sorry," she managed. I was just leaving. I'm almost done. I just need to—" Her phone rang again. Cormac. She stared at the screen. 52 minutes had passed since his first call. 8 minutes had gone somewhere she couldn't account for. She couldn't answer with Tae-jin standing there. She couldn't not answer with an enforcer outside Isaiah's door. Her hand was shaking so badly the phone rattled against the floor. Tae-jin held out his hand. She looked up at him. "Give me the phone," he said. "It's nothing," she said, which was the most catastrophic lie she had ever told. It's a personal matter. I'll step outside and—" "You're not stepping anywhere." He reached down, not roughly, and picked the phone off the floor himself. He looked at the name on the screen. Then he answered it. What happened next, Zuri would replay for years. Not because it was theatrical, not because it was violent, because it was the most quietly devastating display of power she had ever witnessed, and it required absolutely nothing from Tae-jin except the fact of his existence. Cormac started talking immediately, confident, running through his terms again, clearly expecting to hear Zuri's voice. He got about 12 words in before he stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that changes temperature. "Who is this?" Cormac's voice had shifted, just slightly. The professional pleasantness was still there, but it had gone thin at the edges. Tae-jin said his name. On the other end of the line, Zuri heard what might have been a sharp intake of breath, or might have been Cormac setting his phone against his chest for a moment. When he came back, the pleasantness was gone entirely. I wasn't aware Ms. Bellamy had any. I didn't know that she works in my house, Tae-jin said. That means she works in my territory. You've been contacting someone in my territory about a debt she owes you.
I had no idea. The man you sent to Providence Medical. Tae-jin's voice didn't change pitch. It didn't need to. He leaves now. He calls your operation first and tells them the situation is resolved. You'll do this in the next 3 minutes, or I'll want to know why. Zuri watched Tae-jin's face while he listened to whatever Cormac said next. Nothing moved. He could have been checking the weather. Ms. Bellamy's debt to you is cleared, Tae-jin said. Not restructured. Cleared. And because you chose to threaten someone inside my territory without awareness or courtesy, you'll send $50,000 to an account my office will provide by end of business tomorrow. Consider that the cost of not asking first. He paused. If you contact her again, Tae-jin said, I'll take it as a sign that you'd like a different kind of conversation. Do we understand each other? He ended the call and held the phone out to Zuri. She couldn't take it immediately. Her hands weren't reliable. She pressed them against her thighs, breathed through her nose, tried to locate something functional inside herself. Your brother, Tae-jin said. He's ill. It wasn't a question. He'd gathered it from the call. Zuri looked up. Leukemia, she said. He's 19. She didn't know why she added the age, maybe because 19 felt like information that should matter. Tae-jin didn't say anything. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Not warmth exactly, not pity, something more measuring than either. Then he stepped back and nodded toward the corridor that led to the staff entrance. Go to the hospital, he said. You're done for tonight. Zuri stood, unsteady, picked up her cleaning supplies by muscle memory. Thank you. I'm not sure what just, thank you. He had already turned back toward his office. She almost made it to the end of the corridor when she thought of something and stopped. She turned back around. He hadn't closed the door yet. Mr. Seo, her voice came out thinner than she intended. He said end of business tomorrow, the 50,000. Tae-jin looked at her over his shoulder. Will he actually do it? She asked. There was a pause. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed the corner of his mouth, gone, before she could be sure it was there. Yes, he said. He went back inside and closed the door. Zuri stood alone in the corridor for a moment, cleaning supplies in her arms, the phone still warm in her hand, her heart doing something complicated and unsteady in her chest. Then she went to see her brother. She took 3 buses because she'd left her car at home that morning when the second bus would have made her late, and she stood in the rain at each transfer stop without an umbrella because she'd lost hers the previous week and hadn't replaced it, and by the time she got to the hospital, she was soaked through and her sneakers were making sounds with every step. Isaiah was asleep. Room 414 was exactly as she'd left it 2 days ago, except that the chair the nurse had mentioned, the one positioned outside the door, was empty. Zuri stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at her brother's face, at the way he looked younger when he slept, at the IV line and the monitor doing its small patient work, and the particular angle of his shoulders that she'd been watching his whole life, and knew the way she knew her own breathing. She sat down in his chair beside his bed. She had come very close tonight, not to losing him exactly. Cormac wasn't powerful enough to actually reach inside a hospital and disappear, a patient without consequences he couldn't absorb. She knew that logically. But the threat had been real enough, and she had been helpless enough. And the gap between those two things had been bridged tonight by a man she didn't know and hadn't asked, and who owed her absolutely nothing. She sat in the hospital chair until 5 in the morning, when Isaiah woke up and found her there and told her she looked terrible, which was his particular way of saying he was glad she'd come. I do look terrible, she agreed. You're soaking wet. It's raining. Did you sleep? I sat here and watched you sleep. That's basically the same thing. Isaiah looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that had always been too old for his face. Even before the leukemia, he'd had that quality. Something in his gaze that processed more than it should. What happened? Nothing happened, she said. Go back to sleep. He didn't argue, which meant he was still tired.
He turned his face toward the window and she watched him settle back, and the monitor beeped its steady, uncomplicated rhythm, and outside the rain had finally stopped. She didn't tell him about Cormac. She didn't tell him about the phone call, or the corridor, or the man who had set his name into her phone and changed the temperature of the conversation in 11 seconds flat. She sat there until visiting hours ended, and the morning nurse came in to check Isaiah's chart, and then she took 3 buses back to the mansion because she was supposed to be on shift by 9. She was 11 minutes late. Pak was waiting at the staff entrance with his clipboard and his expression, and she apologized and changed into her uniform and started her morning rounds, and the mansion resumed its machinery around her like nothing had happened. Except that something had. She was scrubbing the kitchen countertops when she replayed the call in her head again. Not the part where Tae-jin said his name, though that had its own weight, but the part just before, when he'd reached down and picked her phone off the floor. He hadn't asked, hadn't explained himself, hadn't done the thing most people did when they saw someone in distress, which was produce a series of noises that approximated concern while calculating their own involvement. He had simply reached down and picked up the phone and handled the situation with the same efficiency he apparently applied to everything else. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with any of it. She was wringing out the mop in the utility sink when Pak appeared in the doorway and informed her, in his particular tone that made every sentence sound like a charge at sentencing, that Mr. Seo wanted to see her. Zuri set the mop against the wall, dried her hands, and followed Pak down the corridor toward the East Wing office, which she had cleaned at least twice a week for 9 months, but had never been inside with the occupant actually present. The door was open. Tae-jin was standing at the window. He turned when she entered. In the daylight and in the specific quality of light from the east-facing window, he looked different from the night before. Not softer exactly, but more legible. Like the dark had been doing some of the work of his intimidation, and the morning was a more honest accounting. There was a small box on his desk. "Your hands," he said, and nodded toward it. Zuri looked down at her hands. She had stopped noticing them months ago. The cracked knuckles, the skin at the first joint of her right index finger that had split and resplit so many times, it had developed its own slightly raised ridge of scar tissue. Industrial cleaning chemicals and cold water and repeated contact with bleach had done what 9 months of work will do. The box contained a medical ointment, something expensive, the kind with foreign text on the packaging that she didn't recognize but that spoke clearly to a different category of purchase than the generic brand hand cream she sometimes picked up at the pharmacy. "I don't need," she started. "I don't want blood on my floors," he said, "especially not yours." There were about 14 things she wanted to say to that, starting with several variations on the observation that this was a very strange thing to say to a person, and ending with the acknowledgement that she was oddly, entirely certain he meant exactly what he said and nothing beyond it. She picked up the box. "About last night," she said, because she needed to say it, because she had been raised to say things that needed to be said, regardless of the size of the person she was saying them to. "I haven't thanked you properly. I'm going to." He looked at her steadily. "You're thanked." "I'm not done." She kept her eyes on his face, which felt like an act of controlled courage. "You didn't have to do that. That was what you did for Isaiah, what you told Cormac. That was a kindness I didn't deserve and definitely didn't earn, and I'm not sure why you did it, but it mattered. It mattered more than I can tell you right now." She stopped, took a breath. "Thank you." The silence held for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Go back to work," Tae-jin said. She went. But something had shifted in the east corridor the night before, quiet and unremarked, like a door that hadn't been there before being found standing open. Neither of them had walked through it yet. They would. The morning continued, the mansion resumed its rhythms, and somewhere across Seattle, Cormac Rourke was sitting at a desk, quietly transferring $50,000 to an account he hadn't known existed yesterday morning, because a maid he'd dismissed as powerless had turned out to be employed by the one man in the city whose name made other dangerous men set their phones against their chests and recalculate. Zuri cleaned the east corridor twice. She didn't drop anything. 3 days passed. Zuri cleaned the mansion the way she always had, room by room, floor by floor, working through her checklist with the kind of methodical focus that kept her mind from going places she didn't want it to go.
She polished the long dining table and rearranged the chairs the way Park's printed guidelines specified. She replaced the orchids in the front reception hall because two of the petals had begun to brown at the edges, and Pak had a specific opinion about browning petals. She scrubbed the utility bathroom near the east service entrance until the grout was the same shade of white it had been when the tiles were first laid, because one of the other housemaids had mentioned offhand that Pak inspected grout, and Zuri had learned very quickly inside this house that the things people mentioned offhand were usually the things that mattered most. She did not think about Tae-jin.
She told herself this repeatedly, which meant she was thinking about him constantly. It wasn't what most people would have assumed. It wasn't the way a woman thinks about a man she finds attractive, or at least it wasn't only that, and it wasn't the gratitude she still felt sitting like a stone in the middle of her chest every time she thought about Isaiah in room 414 sleeping safely while Gerald the IV pole squeaked in the corner. It was something more unsettling than either of those things. It was the quality of his attention. Tae-jin looked at people the way a person looks at a problem they are in the process of solving. And the night he'd found her on the floor, he had turned that look on her, and she hadn't been able to shake the feeling that whatever calculation he'd run had produced an answer he hadn't been expecting. She didn't know what to do with being noticed like that. She'd spent 9 months making herself small enough that nobody bothered. She was good at small. She had been practicing small since she was 14 years old and realized that being conspicuous in certain environments was the same as being a target. Small was survival. Small was the reason she still had a job. The ointment sat on her bedside table at home. She used it every night, working it into the cracked skin of her knuckles with slow, careful attention, and her hands were already looking better. She had not told anyone about it. She would not have known what to say. On the morning of the 4th day after the phone call, Zuri arrived for her shift and knew immediately that something had changed. The guards were different, not different people, the same faces she had learned over 9 months to read the way you learn to read weather, but different in their posture, tighter, more deliberate about where they positioned themselves, which doors they watched, which hallways they cleared before moving through. Min-jae, the youngest of the permanent security rotation and the only one who had ever nodded at her with anything resembling warmth, walked past the kitchen door 3 times in 20 minutes without once looking through it. Zuri wrung out her mop and listened. She was good at listening. This was the other thing nobody accounted for when they decided a maid was beneath their notice. She was always in the room. She heard things. She heard the difference between a conversation that stopped when she entered because it was private and a conversation that continued around her because she had become ambient, part of the furniture, no more relevant than the potted plant in the corner. By 9:30 in the morning, she had gathered enough fragments to understand that something was happening with the Kwan Syndicate. The name surfaced twice in the kind of lowered voices that meant it wasn't supposed to surface at all. She didn't know who the Kwan Syndicate was. She didn't need specifics. The word itself carried enough charge. The way Min-jae's jaw tightened when he said it, the way Pak spoke into his earpiece near the front door, and then disconnected and stood very still for a moment with an expression Zuri had never seen on his face before. Pak was calculating the distance between a situation and a catastrophe. She kept her head down and cleaned the kitchen. By 11 that morning, 2 additional SUVs had arrived, and 6 men she didn't recognize were stationed at positions throughout the ground floor. They wore the same kind of clothes as Tae-jin's regular security. Dark, practical, unremarkable. But they moved differently, with a specific economic alertness that suggested a different kind of training. One of them looked at Zuri when she pushed her cart through the east corridor and tracked her progress to the utility closet without expression, and she felt the weight of that look like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. She put her supplies away and went to find Pak. "Should I be somewhere else today?" she asked him. Pak looked at her over his clipboard. "Do your job." "I'm asking because there are 6 men I don't recognize between me and the utility closet, and one of them appears to be watching the hallway like someone's going to come through the wall. Do your job, Ms. Bellamy." She went back to the kitchen and started on the countertops. Tae-jin appeared at noon. She was aware of him before she saw him. That particular quality of attention that entered a room slightly ahead of the person generating it, like a barometric shift. She was wiping down the stovetop when she heard him in the hallway outside the kitchen speaking to Pak, and she focused very carefully on the stovetop and made herself invisible. Eastern shipping corridor, they moved on it last night. 2 containers. Tae-jin's voice was low, direct,
the specific cadence of someone who had already processed the emotional content of bad news and was operating purely on response. That's not a test, that's a statement. We have confirmation it was Kwan's people? Pak asked. We have 4 dock workers in the hospital and a shipping manifest that's been altered twice. What do you think? A pause. Dijung recommends we pull back the western routes temporarily, and Dijung recommends a lot of things. Something in Tae-jin's voice shifted slightly. Not louder, but denser. Tell Daejung I want a full assessment of the eastern corridor by 3, and I want our contacts at the Port Authority to start asking questions quietly, not through Daejung. Another pause. Longer. And the staff? Pak asked. We have 12 civilians in the house today. A beat of silence. Then, reduce it. Keep who you need. Send the others home with full day pay. Zuri heard Pak's footsteps move away down the hall. She kept wiping down the stovetop. You don't need to look busy, Tae-jin said. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not blocking it, he wasn't the kind of person who needed to block doors to make a point. Just present in it, jacket off, the sleeves of his dark shirt rolled to the forearm, looking at her with that same measuring quality that had unsettled her in his office. I wasn't pretending, she said. The stovetop was actually dirty. He looked at the stovetop and then back at her with an expression that suggested he found this mildly interesting in the way a person finds a small, unusual thing interesting before setting it aside. You heard what I said to Pak, he said. It wasn't an accusation. I wasn't trying to. I know. He looked at her for another moment. Are you afraid? The question caught her sideways. People in this house didn't ask questions like that. Direct, without framing, without the diplomatic packaging that let everyone pretend the answer wasn't what it was. Yes, she said. Good, he said, which was not the response she expected. Fear is information. The people I worry about are the ones who stop feeling it. He moved away from the doorway. Then he stopped. Pak is going to tell you to go home today. I heard. Go. I'm in the middle of the kitchen. The kitchen will survive one afternoon. Something crossed his face. Not annoyance, something slightly more complicated. This is not a good day to be in this house. She put the cloth down. She looked at him directly, which she was getting slightly better at. Are you saying that because it's dangerous, or because you're trying to keep me from knowing how dangerous? The pause that followed was about 2 seconds long and told her several things. Both, he said. She picked her cloth back up. I'll go when Pak tells me to. Tae-jin looked at her for a long moment. Then he left. Pak found her 40 minutes later and handed her an envelope with cash, and told her the house was on reduced staffing for the afternoon and she was to return tomorrow at her usual time. She took the envelope, changed out of her uniform, and left through the staff entrance, and 3 of the 6 unfamiliar men watched her cross the parking area to the bus stop without any detectable expression. She sat on the bus and thought about what Tae-jin had said. Fear is information. She turned it over in her mind the whole ride home. She called the hospital from her apartment. Isaiah sounded distracted, which meant he was in the middle of something on his phone, which meant he was well enough to be distracted, and this was the most reliable indicator she had of how he was actually doing. Bad days, he was present, quiet, thoughtful in that specific heavy way. Good days, he was barely paying attention to her. You sound distracted, she said. I'm fine, he said. Isaiah. I'm fine, Zuri. I'm literally just... Hold on. A pause. The sound of something being set down. Okay, what's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with me. You call when something's wrong. I call because you're my brother and you're in the hospital. You call when something's wrong, he repeated with the particular certainty of someone who has known a person their entire life. Is it the job? The job is fine. Is it money? She was quiet for half a second too long. Zuri, it's handled, she said. It's handled, okay? I took care of it. How? Not a question. Isaiah, you need to rest. How did you take care of it? His voice had changed, the distracted quality gone, replaced with something older. He sounded like their father, which he would have hated hearing. Someone help me, she said. And because she couldn't think of anything else to say that was both honest and not terrifying, she left it there. A long pause. What kind of someone? He said. The effective kind. Get some sleep.
She ended the call before he could ask the next question. She lay on her couch and looked at the ceiling and listened to her building's heating system make its usual series of complaints. And outside the window, Seattle moved around its evening business, and she thought about the 6 men stationed between her and a utility closet, and the way Pak had gone still after he ended his call, and the particular weight in Tae-jin's voice when he'd said, "That's not a test, that's a statement." She fell asleep on the couch with the television on low and woke up at 2 in the morning feeling wrong. That specific wrongness of having slept at the wrong hour and in the wrong position and with something unresolved still circling the edges of her thoughts. She went to work the next morning. The next 4 days were the strangest of her 9 months in the mansion. The additional security remained. 2 of the 6 men became ambient the way furniture becomes ambient. She learned to route around them without acknowledging them, and they reciprocated by treating her exactly the way Tae-jin's regular staff always had, which was to say they looked past her rather than at her. She had worked hard for 9 months to become invisible in this house. Now she needed that invisibility to remain useful and was finding it harder to maintain. Because Tae-jin kept looking at her, not conspicuously. He wasn't standing in hallways watching her work. But she would finish cleaning a room and find him in the one adjacent, not waiting. He was never waiting for anything. He moved with the economy of someone who had already decided where he needed to be, but present. And when she passed him in the corridor, he didn't move aside the way other people moved aside for each other. But he also didn't require her to move aside for him. And in the specific social mathematics of this household, that was unusual enough to be notable. On the 5th evening, she came around the corner from the utility closet with an oversized industrial bucket and walked directly into a situation. 2 of Tae-jin's men were in the corridor, along with a 3rd man she didn't recognize who had arrived that afternoon, wider through the shoulders than Min Jae, with the specific stillness of someone who spent a lot of time practicing stillness. Tae-jin was there. They had apparently just concluded some kind of meeting because the 3rd man was picking up a jacket from one of the chairs against the wall, and the energy in the corridor had that particular flatness of a conversation that has said everything it needed to say. Zuri came around the corner with the bucket. She saw them. She overcorrected. The bucket, which was 3/4 full of water and cleaning solution, swung hard on its handle, hit the wall, bounced back, and connected with the corner of the decorative console table against the corridor wall, which sent the slim glass vase on top of the console into the air in a clean arc. Zuri dropped the bucket handle and lunged for the vase. She caught it. This was the surprise. In 9 months, she had developed a reputation inside this household for being exactly as clumsy as she was, which was significantly. She had broken 2 glasses in the kitchen, walked into a door frame hard enough to leave a bruise on her forehead, and once sent an entire tray of linens cascading down the back stairs when she'd caught her foot on the lip of the top step. Pak had a specific expression he reserved for incidents involving Zuri, which she privately called the brace for impact face. She caught the vase. Clean, 2-handed, her back against the wall, bucket rolling away down the corridor. The 3/4 full bucket of cleaning solution had not gone with it because she had held the handle long enough to redirect it against the wall, which meant the contents were now distributed across approximately 6 feet of corridor floor and 1 very expensive pair of shoes. 1 very expensive pair belonging to the wide man she didn't recognize. The silence that followed was the kind that measured itself. Zuri straightened up with the vase in her hands and looked at the shoes and then at the man wearing them and said, "I'm so sorry, Let me get something to—" "Who is this?" The wide man's voice was flat, directed at Tae-jin rather than at Zuri, which was its own particular communication. "Staff say, Tae-jin said. She caught the vase." Tae-jin said it the way someone points out a fact that has concluded the discussion. He looked at Zuri. "Are you hurt?" "No." She was still holding the vase. No. I'm sorry about the—" She gestured at the floor, at the shoes. "Clean it up," Tae-jin said. Not unkindly. She went to get more towels. She heard the wide man say something in Korean as she turned the corner toward the utility closet. She didn't speak Korean. She didn't need to. She'd spent enough time around men who were used to their words not being understood to recognize the specific register. She heard Tae-jin's response, shorter, final. She got her towels and went back and cleaned the floor. The wide man was gone by the time she finished.
Tae-jin was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, on his phone, and he watched her wring out the last towel with an expression she could not interpret, and she carted everything back to the utility closet and told herself very firmly to stop trying to interpret it. That night, one of the kitchen staff, a compact woman named Delphine, who had been in the mansion for 3 years and functioned as the primary source of institutional knowledge among the junior staff, found Zuri in the break room and sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment, which meant she was preparing to say something that required delivery. "The man today," Delphine said. "In the corridor."
The one you got shoes. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't mean to. Delphine waved this off. His name is Cho Byung-ho. He runs distribution for the Eastern Corridor. He and Mr. Seo have been arguing for 2 weeks. Zuri kept her expression neutral. Okay. He's also the one who told Pak last month that the housekeeping staff was overpaid and should be cut by 30%. Delphine smiled slightly. So I'm not crying about his shoes, Zuri said. No, Delphine agreed. I wouldn't either. She paused. I'm telling you because he's going to remember your face now. Men like Cho Byung-ho remember faces. She stood up. Just be careful. Zuri nodded. Delphine left. She sat in the break room for a while and thought about the way Tae-jin had said she caught the vase. 3 days later, the first window blew in. It was 11:40 in the evening. Zuri was not supposed to be in the mansion. Her shift ended at 7. But Pak had called her back at 9 to deal with a cleaning emergency in the west dining room involving a dinner that had apparently ended badly in several senses, and she had been in the process of working through the dining room when the sound hit. It wasn't a single sound. It was a sequence, compressed tight enough that the individual components blurred. The specific crack that she would later understand was a vehicle ramming the perimeter gate, the secondary percussion of the alarm system triggering, the different sound, lower, more definite, of the first-floor windows in the east wing meeting something moving faster than glass was designed to withstand. The lights went out. Emergency backup came on immediately, red-edged and inadequate, enough to see but not enough to see well. Zuri had her phone in her hand. She had her cleaning supplies around her feet. She was standing in the middle of the west dining room when the first gunshots reached her through 2 walls in a corridor, and she stood completely motionless for approximately 3 seconds while her brain caught up to the information her nervous system had already processed. Then she moved toward the door, which was the wrong direction, because the corridor outside the dining room suddenly filled with running feet, and she pressed herself back against the wall behind the door and held her breath while 2 of Tae-jin's guards ran past. And somewhere below her on the ground floor, something hit hard enough to shake the house. And she heard voices she didn't recognize shouting in a language she didn't speak. The dining room door opened. She pressed tighter against the wall. Tae-jin came through the door. He saw her immediately. He was moving with a specific controlled urgency, not running, something more efficient than running, scanning the room as he entered. And for a single suspended second, he looked at her standing behind the door with a cleaning cloth in one hand and her phone in the other, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name. "Come," he said. "What's happening? Now." He had her arm. Not rough, not gentle, just decisive, the grip of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it. He pulled her out of the dining room and into the corridor and moved her in front of him, and she understood from the way he positioned himself that she was supposed to be ahead of him, which meant he was behind her, which meant he was between her and whatever was at the other end of the corridor. They moved fast. She concentrated on matching his pace and not falling, which required genuine effort because the emergency lighting cast shadows at angles that made the floor look uneven where it wasn't, and Tae-jin moved through his own house in the dark with the confidence of someone who had mapped it in his sleep. The sound of shooting intensified briefly and then pulled away, shifting toward the east side of the house. "Are you hit?" Tae-jin asked. "No," she said. "I wasn't. No." "Keep moving." She kept moving. He took her through a door she had cleaned around for 9 months and never seen open, and through a short corridor she had not known existed, and the floor changed from hardwood to poured concrete, and the walls closed in and they went down half a flight of stairs, and she realized she had no idea where she was in relation to any part of the house she knew. Then she heard something wrong in his breathing. It was slight, barely there, a small discontinuity. A breath that started and then caught and then resumed, the kind of sound a person makes when they are overriding something that hurts.
She half turned and he said, "Don't stop." And she kept moving, but she was listening now with a different quality of attention. They reached the door. Tae-jin pressed a code into the panel beside it. 7 digits she didn't watch. And the door opened. Heavy. Reinforced. The sound it made sealing behind them was the sound of something designed to be final. She turned. The room was maybe 400 square feet. Low lighting, the kind that came from strips along the floor. A long table, 2 chairs, a cabinet with a medical kit on top of it. Screens set into the wall showing camera feeds from around the property. She could see men moving, could see vehicles, could see the gate that had been breached, and the 2 guards down near the east perimeter, and the 3 men who were not Tae-jin standing at the entrance to the garden, and she watched this for exactly 2 seconds before she registered what the light was doing to the left side of Tae-jin's shirt. Dark fabric. Dark enough that she hadn't seen it, but the light here was different, and the fabric had the specific heaviness of saturated material, and the left side of Tae-jin's shirt, from roughly the shoulder down, was darker than the right. "You're hit," she said. "Sit down," he said. Sit down." He moved to the cabinet, opened it, pulled out the trauma kit. His left arm was doing approximately 70% of what it should have been doing. He set the kit on the table and looked at her. His face was controlled, completely, utterly controlled. But his breathing had that small catch in it, and his color was wrong under the overhead strip light. "I need you to close this," he said. She looked at the kit, at the suture thread in its sterile packaging, at his shoulder, where the entry wound was visible now that he had opened his shirt with his right hand, slow and precise. She had never stitched anyone in her life. He read her face. "I'll walk you through it," he said. And there was something in his voice that was different from everything she had heard from him in 9 months. Still controlled, still deliberate, but underneath it, threaded through it, the plain, unadorned fact of someone who was hurt and needed help and had nobody else in the room. Zuri pulled the chair out from the table. "Sit down," she said. "Before you fall down." He sat. Her hands were shaking before she even opened the kit. She had held it together in the corridor. She had held it together on the stairs and through the dark passage. And in the moment when she'd understood that the sound behind her was Tae-jin breathing through something that hurt, she had held it together when she told him to sit down. Now she was standing at the table looking at the trauma kit's contents laid out under strip lighting. The suture thread, the curved needle in its sealed packaging, the antiseptic, the gauze, the clamps she didn't know the names of, and her hands were betraying her completely. "Open the antiseptic first," Tae-jin said. His voice was steady. Not calm exactly. There was a quality to it that she recognized now as the specific register of someone applying deliberate control to something that was working against them, but steady. She focused on this bottle. Her fingers found the cap. Routine action. She could do routine actions. "The wound needs to be cleaned before anything else," he said. "Take the gauze. Pour the antiseptic onto it. Don't be gentle about it." "Won't that?" "Yes," he said. "Do it anyway." She pressed the soaked gauze to the wound. Tae-jin's jaw locked. He didn't make a sound. The muscle in his neck pulled tight and released, and she watched his right hand close into a fist on the table surface. And she pressed through it because he had told her to and because the alternative was worse. "You've done this before," she said. Not a question. "Not to myself." His jaw had loosened slightly. The worst of it was past. "The bullet passed through. That's better than the alternative." "How do you know it passed through?" "Because I can feel the exit point." He said it the same way a person says, "Because I checked the weather." "The thread is pre-measured. Take the needle from the packaging. Careful, those are sharper than they look. And thread it the way you'd thread a sewing needle." "I haven't threaded a sewing needle since 8th grade." "Then you're more qualified than most people in this room." She almost laughed. It came out wrong, more air than sound, but it was something. She threaded the needle. Her hands were steadier now, barely, but measurably. "Small stitches," he said, "closer together than you think is necessary. Start at one edge and work across. Don't rush." She started. The first stitch was bad. She could feel it. Too shallow, not catching properly, her angle wrong. She didn't stop. She adjusted. The second was better. By the fourth, she had found something like a rhythm, which was not confidence but was the mechanical relative of confidence, the body continuing when the mind would rather be somewhere else entirely.
Tae-jin was quiet through most of it. The camera feeds on the wall showed movement, his men reorganizing on the property, vehicles repositioning, the east gate being secured by what looked like a four-man team. The shooting had stopped. She didn't know if that was good or bad, and she didn't ask because she needed to concentrate. "Why did you come back for me?" she said. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out between stitches, into the specific quiet of a room designed to seal out everything outside it. Tae-jin looked at her work for a moment. "You were in the house." "There were other people in the house." "Pak accounted for the others." "That's not an answer." A pause. She pulled the thread through, careful. "No," he said. "It isn't." She tied off the last stitch and reached for the gauze. Her hands had stopped shaking entirely somewhere around stitch 6, which she found interesting in the way you find things interesting when your brain is trying to stay focused on something manageable rather than the scope of the things surrounding it. She pressed the gauze pad over the closed wound and held it with 2 fingers while she reached for the medical tape, and her face was maybe 8 inches from Tae-jin's shoulder, and she was aware of the exact distance in a way that had nothing to do with the stitching. "You're not going to pass out, are you?" she asked. "No." "How much blood did you lose?" "Less than it looks like." "That's not a measurement. It's an assessment." Something shifted in his voice. "I've lost more. This is manageable." She secured the gauze and straightened up and looked at him directly. He looked back at her. The strip lighting was honest in the way emergency lighting always was. It didn't soften anything, didn't lend the flattering angles that regular light provided. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a single bad night, but the accumulated weight of something much longer, a tiredness that had been there behind the control all along and was simply more visible now. "Why did you save Isaiah?" she said. She had asked him a version of this before. In his office that first morning, he had redirected her with 2 words. But they were sealed in a room with camera feeds on the wall and his blood on the table, and there was nobody else to redirect to. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I was 16 when my younger brother died." She waited. "Not illness," he said. "A different kind of situation. A debit that wasn't his, owed by people older than him." He stopped, looked at the camera feeds on the wall rather than at her. "I was in a position at 16 where I had access to exactly one category of solution, violence. So I used it, and it didn't help." Zuri set the used gauze on the table and didn't say anything. "Your brother is 19 and has done nothing to deserve any of this," Tae-jin said. "What Cormac Rourke was doing to you was—" He paused, and she saw his jaw work slightly. "It was a thing I understood, structurally, and I was in a position to stop it." "That's not the whole reason," she said. He looked at her then. "You said it didn't make the ledger feel better," she said. "So you knew, before you did it, that it wasn't going to fix the thing you were trying to fix. You did it anyway." A long silence. "You were crying," he said finally, "outside my door. I heard you for almost 4 minutes before I opened it." He looked at her with that direct, measuring quality that she had been slowly learning to hold without flinching. "I don't find it easy to listen to someone crying and do nothing." She absorbed this, filed it in the part of her mind that was trying to assemble a complete picture of this man from fragments, the way you piece together the full image of something from partial glimpses. "Your brother," she said. "What was his name?" Tae-jin looked at the camera feeds. "Seo-jun." She nodded. Didn't say she was sorry. He wasn't telling her for condolences. She understood that without having to work it out. On the wall of screens, something changed. She saw it before he did. Movement on the feed from the east corridor, one of his men walking in a direction that didn't match the reorganization pattern she'd been watching. The man stopped, made a call on his cell phone rather than his radio, turned slightly, body angled away from the nearest camera. Tae-jin had seen it too. His face went very still. "Who is that?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He was watching the screen with an expression she'd never seen on him before, and it took her a moment to identify it because it was the last thing she expected, something that, under the stripped-down honesty of this room, looked like it might have been the beginning of a specific kind of anger. "That's Dae-jung," he said. She didn't know who Dae-jung was. She had heard the name once, in the conversation outside the kitchen, and filed it without context. She filed it now with context, watching the man on the screen end his call and pocket his phone and resume walking. And something in the quality of his resumed walking was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate but could feel clearly. The door unsealed with a pressure release sound. Minji was outside with two other men, and when he saw Tae-jin's shoulder, his face produced a brief involuntary expression that he locked down in under a second. Tae-jin stood. He was steadier than he should have been, standing from that chair, but he held it. "I need a full sweep," Tae-jin said. "All of it." Minji nodded. "The east gate is secured. We have 3 casualties on their side, and—" "I need the sweep first," Tae-jin said. "Then casualties. Understood?" Minji understood. Tae-jin looked at Zuri. "You'll stay here until Minji confirms the perimeter. Then someone will take you home." "You're not staff anymore tonight," he said. "Tonight you're someone who was in my house when my house was attacked. That means I'm responsible for getting you out of it safely." He moved toward the door, then stopped, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her. "You did well, with the stitching." She looked at the table where the used materials were still laid out. "It's not pretty." "It doesn't need to be pretty," he said. "It just needs to hold." He went through the door. It sealed behind him. Zuri sat in the room with the camera feeds for 26 minutes before Min-jae came back and walked her out through a secured route to a car, which took her home through streets still wet from earlier rain, with a driver who said nothing and a view through the window of Seattle going about its night, entirely unaware that a perimeter gate had been rammed and windows had blown in, and a woman who cleaned floors for a living had stitched up a man who controlled the criminal architecture of 3 cities. She went home. She showered. She sat on the edge of her bed at 3 in the morning and looked at her hands, which were steady, and thought about a boy named Seo Tae-jin and a man who had built an empire from a grief that came in too early and had no other outlet. She called the hospital. Isaiah was sleeping. The overnight nurse confirmed it in the patient tone of someone accustomed to family members calling at 3 in the morning, and Zuri thanked her and ended the call and sat in the dark for a while before she finally lay down. She was back at the mansion by 9 the next morning. Pak met her at the staff entrance with his clipboard and his expression, and she braced for the brace for impact face, but what she got instead was something she hadn't seen from him before. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Briefing at 9:30. You're included." She blinked. What?" 9:30. He turned and walked away, which was Pak's standard method of indicating that the conversation was over. The briefing was in the ground floor meeting room, which Zuri had cleaned many times and sat in never. There were 8 people present, 3 of Tae-jin's core security team, Pak, a man she recognized as the head of the shipping operation from a photograph on the wall of the corridor, Min-jae, Delphine, which was the most surprising thing, and Tae-jin, who was standing at the head of the table and had changed his shirt. Zuri sat down in the chair nearest the door. Tae-jin looked at her briefly when she entered. Not warmly, not coldly, just acknowledgement. "Last night was coordinated," Tae-jin said, without preamble. "The gate breach and the east window breach happened within 40 seconds of each other. That level of coordination requires inside knowledge. Specifically, it requires knowing the rotation schedule and the precise timing of the security system's reset cycle." The room was very quiet. "The reset cycle was changed 8 days ago," Tae-jin said. "It was communicated to exactly 4 people inside this organization. Everyone else in this room, including the security rotation, was working with the previous schedule." Zuri looked around the table. She watched faces. This was something she had been doing for 9 months without realizing she'd been doing it. Reading rooms, reading the specific texture of people's reactions, cataloging the small physical tells that happened in the gap between hearing something and deciding how to respond to it. Most faces in the room produced variations of the same expression: controlled alarm, the expression of people hearing something serious that confirmed a fear they'd already been working through. One face did something different. It was fast. Faster than a blink, almost. A micro-contraction around the eyes, the specific involuntary tensing of someone who has heard something that lands closer to home than it should. The face smoothed immediately, professionally, thoroughly. But the interval between stimulus and recovery was slightly longer than the others. Zuri looked at the man. She didn't recognize him. He was seated 2 seats to her left, towards the middle of the table, close-cropped hair, dark jacket, the type of face that photographed as unremarkable,
which was a particular quality she associated with people who had cultivated it deliberately. She had seen this man before, not in a meeting, not in the corridor during working hours. The memory surfaced slowly, the way memories did when you'd filed them without knowing you were filing them. The service entrance. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. She had been taking out cleaning supply boxes for recycling, the cardboard, folded flat, stacked against the exterior wall. And this man had been at the service entrance in conversation with someone she hadn't looked at directly because she'd trained herself not to look directly at things that weren't her business. She had looked at him, though, because he'd been talking quietly and the body language had been that specific configuration of two people who didn't want to be visible, and she had looked for long enough to register his face before she'd gone back inside. She couldn't see who he'd been talking to. She could see him now. She looked back at Tae-jin, who was still speaking, laying out the sequence of last night's events in the flat, precise language of someone reconstructing a failure in order to prevent the next one. She looked back at the man 2 seats to her left. She looked at the table surface. She thought about Delphine's voice saying men like Cho Byung-ho remember faces. She thought about Tae-jin standing in the kitchen doorway saying fear is information. She thought about 8 days ago and 4 people and a reset cycle. Then she made herself think about it more carefully, because the stakes of being wrong were a specific kind of catastrophic she couldn't afford. She was a housemaid in a room she'd never sat in before, in an organization she didn't belong to, and if she pointed at the wrong person, she would not be a housemaid in this room anymore. She would be a problem. But she had seen his face. She had seen it at the service entrance. The meeting concluded 20 minutes later. Tae-jin said something to Min-jae in Korean and dismissed the room. People filed out. Zuri stood and moved toward the door and then stopped. She turned back. Tae-jin was looking at her. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He looked at the remaining people in the room and said something she didn't understand, and they left. And then it was just the two of them, and the long table, and the particular quality of a room that had just been full of people and was now full of the absence of them. "I saw someone at the service entrance," she said, "about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I don't know the exact date. I was taking out recycling in the late afternoon. It was a Thursday, I think, because Thursday is when I do the supply room. And a man was having a conversation at the service entrance with someone I didn't see. A conversation that was, they didn't want to be seen having it." Tae-jin was very still. "The man you just had in the room," she said. 2 seats to my left. Dark jacket. I was at the service entrance." The silence lasted approximately 5 seconds. "Show me," he said. He pulled up the meeting room's internal camera feed on his tablet and scrolled back to the recording. Zuri watched the playback of the last 20 minutes, the room full of people, and pointed without hesitation. Tae-jin looked at where her finger was on the screen. "That's Dae-jung," he said. She looked at him. "Park Dae-jung," he said, and his voice had that density she'd heard outside the kitchen, the voice that wasn't louder but was heavier. "He has been with this organization for 6 years. He runs our Eastern distribution analysis. He was one of the 4 people who received the new reset cycle schedule." Zuri lowered her hand. "I know what I saw," she said. "I know you do," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, immediate, without qualification, was the most plainly direct expression of trust she had received from him, which was remarkable and also, she understood suddenly, the beginning of something much more dangerous than what had already happened. What happened next moved fast. Within 2 hours, Tae-jin had pulled surveillance from the service entrance for the 5-week period prior to the attack. The footage was degraded in the specific way footage gets degraded when someone who knows the system has quietly intervened, and the gap was small. 4 days, targeted, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it. And if Zuri hadn't given him the approximate date, the window of interest would have been too wide to isolate the deletion. The 4-day deletion mapped directly to a 3-day window before the new reset schedule was distributed. Park Dae-jung had deleted the footage before he knew what he would need to hide, which meant he'd been planning it long enough to cover himself in advance, which meant the attack last night had not been opportunistic. It had been carefully, patiently built from the inside, and the man doing the building had been in this house, eating in the same kitchen, using the same corridors, walking past the same orchids in the entrance hall that Zuri replaced every week when they started to brown. Tae-jin called Min-jae. He spoke for 90 seconds. Min Jae's face on the phone screen did the thing Park's face had done in the entrance hall after his call. A specific stillness, the stillness of recalculating everything you thought you knew. Dae-jung was not in the building. He had left 30 minutes after the briefing ended, citing a meeting with the Port Authority contact. The Port Authority contact confirmed, when reached, that no meeting had been scheduled. Dae-jung's phone was off. His car was in the parking structure. His apartment, when Min-jae sent 2 men there 40 minutes later, had the specific quality of a place that had been rapidly cleared of the things that mattered. Laptop gone, a drawer left open, 2 dress shirts still on hangers that had clearly held more. The mole had run. Tae-jin stood at the window of his office. She was there because he hadn't told her to leave, and she hadn't left, which was its own kind of crossing, and looked at the harbor in the distance and didn't move for almost a full minute. Then he turned around, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before because it wasn't controlled.
It was controlled on the surface. The professional architecture was intact, but underneath it there was something that had weight and heat and a long history behind it. And she understood that Park Dae-jung had not simply sold security information to a rival organization. He had done it from inside 6 years of proximity, 6 years of access, 6 years of Tae-jin trusting the operational judgment of someone who had been pointing a knife at him from the inside.
He would have known about Isaiah, Tae-jin said. Zuri went cold. The thought arrived complete. Dae-jung knew the organizational map. He knew territories and contacts and vulnerabilities. He had been selling that information to the Kwon Syndicate. The Kwon Syndicate had seen Tae-jin personally protect Zuri during the attack. If Dae-jung had provided them with her identity, her history, her brother's name and location, Isaiah, she said. I have 2 men at the hospital now, Tae-jin said. Min Jae called them while I was talking to you. He's covered. She pressed both hands against the edge of the desk because her legs were doing the thing they'd done in the corridor 9 months ago, not quite working, all the structural integrity gone out of them. For how long, she said. How long does 2 men at a hospital cover him if the Kwon Syndicate decides it's a temporary measure? Tae-jin came away from the window. He stopped on the other side of the desk. It gives us time to figure out what Dae-jung has already given them and what they're planning to do with it. He's been gone 30 minutes, she said. He had a head start. He could be across the border by... He won't get across the border, Tae-jin said, and in his voice was the specific certainty of someone with enough architecture in enough cities that a border was less a barrier than a formality. She believed him. That was the thing about trusting someone who operated in Tae-jin's particular world. When they said something with that quality of certainty, the certainty was based on actual capacity rather than bravado. It was almost more unsettling than comforting. She straightened up and let go of the desk, looked at him. He knew about Isaiah from the hospital records, she said, working it through out loud. Or from Cormac. Cormac had Isaiah's room number. If Dae-jung had contact with Cormac's operation, he did, Tae-jin said. Cormac's operation, he did, Tae-jin said. That's how the Kwon Syndicate knew who you were before the attack. The room reconfigured itself around this information. She stood in the middle of it and let it land. Cormac's call to her had not been separate from the larger threat. It had been part of it. A pressure test. See if the maid breaks. See if Tae-jin steps in to protect her. Confirm the intelligence that she matters to him before the assault. She had been a diagnostic tool in someone else's plan. Tae-jin was watching her face. She didn't know what he was reading there, but she was past the point of managing what was readable. She was standing in the private office of a man who ran a criminal organization in 3 cities, having been used as bait in a plan designed to expose his vulnerabilities, with her brother in a hospital bed 2 miles away with 2 guards outside his door, and the traitor who had engineered all of it was currently somewhere in Seattle with a 30-minute head start. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her for a moment. That's not a question I expected, he said. What do you need? She said again. I can identify Dae-jung. I can go back through the last few months and tell you every time I saw him in a place or a configuration that seemed off, because I see everything in this house and everyone assumes I don't, and that means I probably saw things that aren't in any of your surveillance records. Something shifted in Tae-jin's face. Start from the beginning, he said. Everything you remember about Park Dae-jung, don't sort it, don't decide what's relevant, everything. She pulled out the chair she'd come in to sit down in 9 months ago and had never used and sat down. She started talking.
By the time she was halfway through the second month of accumulated observations, who Dae-jung had spoken to in hallways and how, when he'd adjusted his route through the house for no apparent operational reason, the 3 times she'd seen him near the external communications junction that nobody used except for system maintenance, Tae-jin had his tablet out and was cross-referencing her timeline against the surveillance archive with an expression of contained, focused intensity. She was 20 minutes into it when Min-jae called. She watched Tae-jin's face while he listened. She had been learning his face for weeks, involuntarily, the way you learn the details of something you're in close proximity to for long enough. She knew the specific quality of his stillness when he was processing something he'd expected. She knew the slightly different quality when it was something he hadn't. What she saw now was neither. He ended the call and looked at her across the table. "They have Isaiah," he said. The words didn't reach her immediately. There was an interval, brief, complete, where her brain produced the sentence and she heard it, and the meaning of it sat outside of her, not entering, not registering, the way very cold water feels like nothing for the first second before it hits. Then it hit. "They took him from the hospital," Tae-jin said. His voice was steady in the specific way of someone holding something in place through the application of focused will. 40 minutes ago, before my men arrived. Dae-jung didn't run, Zuri. He was a distraction. He gave us something to chase so we'd focus on him and the hospital would be, she was already standing. "Sit down," he said. "They have my brother." Her voice came out different from her own voice, flattened, strangely calm in a way that frightened her. "He's 19 years old and he's sick, and they—" "Sit down," Tae-jin said, and this time it wasn't a command, it was something else. Something that came from the same place as I heard you for 4 minutes, and didn't open the door until I couldn't not. She sat down. Her hands were on the table, both of them. Flat. Pressing into the surface the way you press into something solid when the rest of the world has lost its structural integrity. Tae-jin leaned forward, his forearms on the table, close enough that she could see the line of exhaustion under his eyes and the specific quality of his focus, which was not the focus of someone who had given up on a situation. "They have him because he matters to you," Tae-jin said, "and you matter to me. That is what they know and what they are using, which means Isaiah is more valuable to them alive and functional than the alternative. That is the one piece of leverage we have right now." She looked at him. "They're going to call," he said, "and when they do, we need to be ready to use everything you just gave me." On the desk between them, his phone lit up. Unknown number. He looked at her once. She nodded, a single motion, something between permission and preparation. He answered it and put it on speaker, and the voice that came through was not one she recognized, but what it said in its first 7 words dismantled every boundary she had been living inside for the past 9 months. And when she looked at Tae-jin across that desk, it was with the face of someone who had just run out of the version of herself that survived by making herself small. The voice on the phone was unhurried. That was the first thing. Not aggressive, not theatrical, unhurried, in the way of someone who had already run the calculation and liked the result. A man's voice, lightly accented, with the specific cadence of someone who had learned English as a 3rd or 4th language and had arrived at fluency through extended practice rather than immersion. "Mr. Seo," the voice said, "I imagine you've had an interesting morning." Tae-jin said nothing. "The boy is comfortable," the voice continued. "He has his medication. He's confused, which is understandable given the circumstances, but he's physically intact. We have no interest in damaging him. He is, as I'm sure you've already determined, considerably more valuable to us in his current condition." Zuri's hands were still flat on the table. She was pressing them into the surface hard enough that the pressure had moved up into her wrists. "What do you want?" Tae-jin said. "Simplicity itself. You withdraw from the Eastern Corridor completely. The shipping contracts, the Port Authority relationships, the Vancouver distribution agreements, all of it. You pull back to your Seattle core operation, you sign a written acknowledgement of territorial boundaries, and you do this within 72 hours. We verify the withdrawal through our own channels. Once we're satisfied, the boy goes back to his hospital bed, and a brief, deliberate pause. Staff member can visit him." The pause was not accidental. It was a demonstration. They knew. Whatever Dae-jung had told them about Zuri's specific significance to Tae-jin, it had been enough to structure the call around it. I'll need to speak to him, Tae-jin said. Of course. A shuffling sound. A pause with ambient noise in it. Nothing identifiable, no location signatures. A space that had been carefully selected for acoustic neutrality. Then Isaiah's voice. He sounded scared. That was the first thing Zuri registered, before the words, just the quality of his voice, which she had been monitoring her whole life the way you monitor something precious and fragile. And right now it had the specific texture of a 19-year-old trying very hard not to sound as frightened as he was. Zuri. Just her name. Then, I'm okay. They said to tell you I'm okay. She pressed her fist against her mouth. Tae-jin's eyes moved to her face for a fraction of a second and then back to the phone. Isaiah, she said, and her voice came out steady, which cost her everything she had. Don't, his voice dipped. Don't do whatever they're asking, okay? Whatever it is. Don't. She heard someone take the phone from him, then the unhurried voice again. 72 hours, Mr. Seo. We'll be in touch with the verification procedures. The call ended. The room held its silence. Tae-jin set the phone on the table. He looked at it for a moment, and in that moment his face did the thing it rarely did. It showed something. Not the surface control, not the measuring quality, but the actual thing underneath, which was not cold and not indifferent, and which had a name she wasn't going to say out loud in this room. Then it was gone, and he picked up his phone and called Min Jae. Find out where that call originated, he said. Every technical resource we have. I want a location within 2 hours. Tae-jin. Her own voice surprised her. She'd used his name. Not Mr. Seo, not anything careful. His name directly, the way you address someone when you've crossed past the formalities because the situation has burned them away. He looked at her. They're going to kill him, she said. Not now, but after. If you give them the corridor or you don't, it doesn't matter. Isaiah is a liability the moment this resolves. He's a 19-year-old who was snatched from a hospital bed and he can identify people. A pause. Yes, Tae-jin said. So the 72 hours is the window? Yes. Then stop talking to Minji about tracking the call and start talking to me about what we actually know, she said, because I've been inside this house for 9 months, and I saw Park Dae-jung at that service entrance, and I have spent 30 minutes telling you everything I remember, and some of that has to be useful right now. He ended the call with Min Jae, looked at her across the table. Tell me again, he said. The second time you saw Dae-jung at the service entrance, the one you weren't sure about the date. Walk me through it exactly. She walked him through it. It took 12 minutes. He didn't interrupt. He pulled up maps on his tablet. Not digital maps, physical maps, hand annotated, the kind that reflected operational knowledge rather than publicly available geography. She watched him mark something on the eastern waterfront section. Then he pulled up a separate file. There's a property, he said, in the Kwan Syndicate's extended operational network, not registered to them, registered to a shipping logistics company that was absorbed by a Kwan-adjacent holding corporation 14 months ago. It's cold. We dismissed it because there's been no visible activity there in 8 months. He turned the tablet to face her. She looked at the satellite image. A commercial warehouse complex. Waterfront adjacent, eastern side of the port district. 3 buildings, enclosed loading area, water access via a private dock. The service entrance conversation you described, he said. The direction Dae-jung's contact was walking when they separated. South, she said, and east. He looked at the map. That's consistent, he said. How confident are you? 60%, he said, which is 30% more than everything else I currently have. Then it's 60% more than nothing, she said. What do you do with 60%? He looked at her. Then he called Min Jae back and gave him an address. What happened in the next 4 hours was not something Zuri experienced in sequence. It was experienced in fragments, the way high-stress time always fragmented, stretches of waiting that compressed to nothing in memory, punctuated by moments that preserved themselves in specific detail. The particular sound of Tae-jin's voice when he was giving operational instructions, which dropped register slightly, became more clipped. The way Min Jae's team organized in the ground floor meeting room with the economy of people running a rehearsed process. The untouched coffee cup on the table that someone had brought for Tae-jin and that he hadn't touched because he'd stopped mid-movement when his phone produced new information and hadn't returned to it.
She sat at the side of the room. Nobody told her to leave. She thought about this later. Nobody told her to leave, and Tae-jin didn't tell her to leave, and the absence of that instruction was its own instruction. At 2:47 in the afternoon, surveillance from the Port District confirmed movement at the waterfront complex. 2 vehicles. A shift rotation at the main building entrance. The kind of movement that meant occupied. 60% became 80. Tae-jin stood at the head of the table and looked at his team. Isaiah Bellamy is 19 years old and is currently undergoing cancer treatment, he said. He is not part of this operation and he is not expendable. Priority 1 is his extraction, before anything else resolves. Priority 2 is Kwon Jin-hyuk. He said the name the same way he'd said everything else, without theatrical weight, just information. He's been running this organization through proxies for long enough that I'm done extending him the courtesy of distance. Tonight that ends. Min-jae asked about Daejung. Daejung is a secondary concern, Tae-jin said. He delivered what they needed and they'll have moved him somewhere. He knows we know. He's not at that warehouse. A brief silence. And the plan for withdrawal? One of the security team asked. If they're monitoring, we're going to give them something to monitor, Tae-jin said. And he laid out the secondary operation, the false confirmation, the paperwork that would move through the right channels in the right sequence to look, to anyone tracking it from the outside, like the beginning stages of a territorial withdrawal. Enough to keep the Kwon Syndicate's attention on the negotiation. Enough to make them believe they had 72 hours. Zuri watched him build the architecture of it in real time. She watched the men around the table track it, ask questions, adjust. She watched Tae-jin absorb the adjustments and incorporate them and keep moving. And she thought about what he had said in the panic room about being 16 years old and having access to exactly one category of solution. He had expanded his categories since then. That was what she was watching. She also thought about Isaiah telling her, don't do whatever they're asking. Her brother, 19 years old, sick, in a building somewhere in the Port District, telling her from inside the situation to hold her ground. She was so tired of loving someone who was braver than the circumstances required. At 4:15 p.m., Tae-jin looked across the room at her. You should stay here, he said. No. The room produced a brief collective stillness. Zuri? Min-jae started. No. She looked at Tae-jin. I know what Isaiah looks like when he's crashing. I know what his warning signs are. I know his medication schedule. I know what he needs in the first few minutes after a bad episode, and it is not the same as what a healthy person needs. If you go in there and get him out, and he's in the middle of a crash, and nobody knows what they're looking at, she stopped. I'm going. Tae-jin looked at her for a long moment. You stay with Min-jae, he said. You don't move without him. When Isaiah is extracted, you go to him and you do not go anywhere else. Understood? Understood, she said. The next hour was preparation. She spent most of it in a side room with one of the medics on Tae-jin's team, walking him through Isaiah's current treatment protocol, the medications, the specific symptoms to watch for, what constituted stable versus what constituted call for intervention. The medic was competent and attentive, and she drilled him until she was satisfied. Then she put on the jacket Min-jae handed her, which was dark and heavy and had an inner lining. She didn't examine too closely, and she sat in the back of the third vehicle in the convoy and watched Seattle's Port District come toward them through the window and breathed through her nose and tried to locate the version of herself that had held a needle steady through 8 stitches while the building shook. She found it. It was still there, steadier than she'd expected. The convoy stopped 4 blocks from the target location. The light had gone gray, the specific flat gray of Seattle, in early evening when the clouds came in off the water and compressed the sky. Zuri could smell salt and diesel fuel and wet concrete. Min-jae was in the front seat. He turned and looked at her. We wait here, he said. The extraction team goes in first. When they confirm Isaiah's location and status, we move. She nodded. She looked at her phone. No signal in this area, or the signal was being blocked. She couldn't tell which. The screen showed full bars, but nothing was connecting. They block the local network when they run a site like this, Min-jae said, reading her look. It keeps anyone inside from calling out. Isaiah had been in there for hours without being able to call anyone. She set her phone face down on the seat and looked out the window. The first 20 minutes were silence, real silence. Minjai didn't feel it, the driver didn't feel it, and Zuri discovered something about herself sitting in the back of that car, which was that she was capable of a quality of stillness she hadn't known she possessed. She had always been motion, nervous motion, corrective motion, the constant small adjustments of someone managing too many variables at once. Here there was nothing to adjust. There was only waiting and the gray light and the smell of salt water. Then Minja's earpiece produced something. His face changed. "They've confirmed he's in building 2, he said. "Ground floor. He's ambulatory. He's—" A pause, listening. "He's arguing with someone." She almost laughed. It came out exactly right this time. "That's him," she said. "Extraction moves in 4 minutes," Minji said. He was already turning, communicating something through the earpiece. "We hold until confirmation of secured perimeter." 4 minutes. She counted them. Not on the clock. She'd flipped her phone back over and was watching it without seeing it, but in the specific physical way of counting that happened when the body had been running at high alert for long enough that it started marking time in heartbeats. Her count reached somewhere between 3 minutes and 4 when the sound came. Not gunfire, something lower, more industrial. An impact, structural, the sound of something large being forced. Then secondary sounds, faster, less definable. The sonic texture of a situation that had been planned encountering the reality of a situation that was in motion. "We go," Minji said. The car moved. The block between their position and the warehouse complex took 45 seconds to cover. The gate to the loading area was open. Forced open, she understood when they went through it. The locking mechanism bent back in a way that required significant applied force. 2 of Tae-jin's men were at the entrance to Building 2. One of them had his hand pressed to his upper arm and was standing with the specific careful posture of someone managing something that hurt while remaining operational. Minjae was out of the car before it fully stopped. Zuri was out directly behind him. "Building is being cleared," one of the entrance guards said. "Ground floor is secure, southeast corner. The kid is—" "Take me there," Zuri said. He took her there. The interior of Building 2 smelled like engine oil and standing water, and the specific cold of a space that had been unheated for longer than it had been occupied. Temporary lighting had been strung along the main corridor, cheap construction-grade stuff, casting everything in the flat yellow of work sites. 3 men she didn't recognize were on the floor. 2 were secured. She looked at them and looked away. The third was not moving, and she looked away from that too. Isaiah was in the southeast corner, which had been set up as a holding area, a cot, a folding chair, a camp heater that was doing insufficient work against the ambient temperature. He was sitting on the cot when she came around the corner. One of Tae-jin's extraction team was 2 feet away from him, and Isaiah was doing exactly what Minji's earpiece report had indicated. He was arguing, in the specific low-voiced, controlled manner he'd developed in hospitals over 2 years of having no physical energy to waste on volume. He looked up when she came around the corner. She crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and went to her knees in front of the cot and grabbed his face in both hands the same way she had when he was 7 years old and had fallen out of the backyard tree, and she'd needed to look at his face to confirm he was intact. He was pale. He was exhausted. There was a bruise developing at the left temple that she hadn't seen coming and which sent a spike of cold fury through her that she set aside to be dealt with later. His eyes were clear. "You look terrible," he said. "You have a bruise on your face," she said. "I walked into something." "Isaiah, I genuinely walked into something when they were moving me. It's fine." He put his hands over hers where they were still holding his face. "Zuri, I'm okay." She held his face for another moment. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at him properly. Did the inventory, color, breathing, the quality of his eye contact, the position of his hands, and whether they were shaking. He was scared and cold and exhausted, and he had a bruise on his temple. He was okay. "Can you walk?" she said. "I've been walking around that room for 3 hours because they didn't give me anything to do, and I can't sleep when I'm stressed." "You should have been sleeping." "I was kidnapped, Zuri." "You should have been sleeping anyway." She stood, her legs held. She looked at the extraction team member. "We need to move him. He needs warmth and his regular medications. Do you have the medic's number?" "He's outside." "Get him in here." The next 15 minutes were organized by the part of her brain that had been running Isaiah's medical logistics for 2 years and could do it in her sleep, which was essentially what she was doing now. She walked the medic through the immediate priorities: core temperature, blood pressure, the specific sequence of medications that needed to happen in the next 90 minutes, given what had been missed while Isaiah was here. The medic had everything she'd listed. She had not given him that information for nothing. Isaiah watched her work with an expression she knew well, a combination of exasperation and something more complicated underneath it. The look of someone who had been taken care of so thoroughly and for so long that he sometimes forgot, and then was reminded how much weight his sister had been carrying on his behalf. "Who are these people?" he said, when there was a pause. She looked at him. "The person whose house I work in," she said. He helped. Isaiah looked around the warehouse with its temporary lighting and its secured men and the general texture of a situation that had involved significantly more than housekeeping. "What does he do?" Isaiah said. "Specifically." "He runs things," she said. "What kind of—" "Isaiah." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Outside, the situation was not resolved. She understood this from the quality of movement she could read through the open door. Purposeful, still active, not the decompression of a completed operation. Minjai was on his earpiece. The two entrance guards had been joined by a third. A vehicle she hadn't seen arrive was now at the loading dock entrance. She got Isaiah to the vehicle and into the warmth of it, and the medic settled in beside him. Then she looked for Tae-jin. He was not in the loading area. "Where is he?" she said to Minjae. Minjae looked at her with the expression of someone who was deciding how much information to provide. This was a miscalculation. She had been deciding how much information to provide to people for 2 years and could recognize the calculation from the receiving end. "Minjae," she said. "Where is he?" "Building 3, he said. "There's a second situation." "What second situation?" He pressed his earpiece, listened. His face did the recalibrating thing. She moved toward Building 3. "Miss Bellamy." Minji was behind her, not blocking her, which she noted. "The situation in there is—" "I'm going," she said. She went. Building 3 was connected to Building 2 via a covered corridor that smelled of rust and old machinery. The doors at the far end were open, and through them came light, better light than the temporary construction strings, actual installed lighting, which meant this building had been used more recently and more seriously. She stopped in the doorway. The interior was set up as an operational space. Not large, maybe 60 feet by 40. Tables. Equipment she didn't try to identify. 3 men who had been in the process of leaving rapidly when Tae-jin's team had arrived and had been interrupted in this process, 2 of whom were now seated on the floor with their hands secured. The third was not seated. He was at the far end of the room, standing in the specific posture of someone who has accepted that the situation has gone against them but has not yet accepted the final consequences of this. He was middle-aged, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had the particular blankness of someone who had spent decades practicing it. She understood from the quality of everyone else's attention that this was Kwon Jin-hyuk. Tae-jin was standing 4 feet from him. He had a cut along the left side of his jaw that was still producing blood, not quickly but steadily, the kind of wound that needed pressure. His shoulder, the sutured shoulder, was holding, as far as she could tell from the door, but he was carrying his left side slightly differently than his right, a compensation that she had become expert in reading in the last 18 hours. He was talking to Kwon Jin-hyuk in Korean. She didn't understand the words. She understood the conversation. It had the quality of something being concluded. Kwon Jin-hyuk said something back, short. His eyes moved from Tae-jin to the door where Zuri was standing, and in his face when he saw her was a specific calculation, the same one she'd seen in Cormac Rourke's framework 9 months ago. A woman, ancillary, relevant only as leverage. She held his gaze. She did not look away. Something shifted in Kwon Jin-hyuk's face, something that hadn't been there before. Not respect exactly, but the recalibration that happened when a variable didn't behave as modeled. Tae-jin had not looked at the door. I was watching Kwon Jin-hyuk's face, and he read whatever had changed in it, and he turned enough to confirm what Kwon had looked at. And when he saw Zuri standing in the doorway, his face went through something very fast and very complicated. Then he turned back to Kwon Jin-hyuk and said 3 words. Whatever they were final. Kwon Jin-hyuk sat down on the floor. Not violently, not dramatically. The specific dissent of someone who has done the remaining calculation and arrived at the rational outcome.
Two of Tae-jin's men moved in. Tae-jin came toward the door. He walked with the economy of someone in controlled pain, each step deliberate, the compensating tilt of his left side more pronounced in motion than in stillness. The cut on his jaw was still bleeding. He stopped in the doorway, close enough that she could see the exact quality of exhaustion in his face, which was substantial, the kind that had come in over hours and would not be addressed by sleep alone. "Isaiah," he said. "He's in the vehicle," she said. "He's okay. He's okay." Tae-jin exhaled. One breath, controlled, the specific release of something that had been held at pressure for hours. "You need your jaw looked at," she said. "I know. And your shoulder. I know. You're leaning. I'm aware of how I'm standing, Zuri. You're leaning, and you have been since you walked through that door, and if you split those stitches after everything I went through to close them, I'm going to be very— Zuri?" She stopped. He looked at her. The doorway light was behind her and in front of him, and his face was fully legible in it in the specific way it had been in the panic room, stripped of the professional architecture, just the actual face underneath. "Thank you," he said. She understood that he was not thanking her for the stitches, or for the information about Dae-jung, or for any single thing. He was thanking her for the specific accumulation of the past 18 hours, which had required a category of herself she hadn't known she possessed until the situation called for it. "Isaiah is in the car," she said. "Let's go." They went. The drive back moved through the gray Seattle evening, 3 vehicles, Zuri in the second with Tae-jin and Min-jae, Isaiah in the third with the medic. She could see the taillights of the third vehicle through the back window, and she watched them with the particular attention of someone who has had the thing they love most taken from them once tonight and needs continuous visual confirmation that it has been returned. Tae-jin sat beside her. His jaw had been dressed. Min-jae had managed it in the loading area, quick and imprecise, the kind of first aid that served as placeholder for something better. He was on his phone for the first 12 minutes of the drive, speaking in short Korean sentences that she didn't try to follow, and then he put the phone down and sat with it in his hand and looked at the seat back in front of him. "Kwon Jin-hyuk," she said. "He'll be arrested before morning," Tae-jin said. "The financial documentation that goes to federal investigators tonight will make sure of that. His organization's financial records, the evidence of the Port Authority bribes, the Vancouver connection." He paused. "I've been building that file for 8 months." "You were planning this," she said. "I was preparing for it," he said. "There's a difference. Planning implies I knew how it would unflock. Preparing means I made sure I'd have what I needed when it did." He looked at her. "I didn't plan for any of this." She looked back at him. "Dae-jung will surface," he said. "He has nowhere to go that I can't reach. That's a matter of time and patience, and I have both." "And Cormac Rourke?" Something crossed Tae-jin's face. "He cleared out of Seattle this morning. He's gone." "Good," she said, and meant it with a completeness that surprised her. The vehicle slowed. She looked out the window. They were not at the mansion. They were at a different location, something she didn't recognize. A private medical facility from the look of it. Exterior cameras and a secured entrance and the kind of lighting that signaled institutional rather than residential. "Isaiah needs proper medical assessment," Tae-jin said. "This is the facility I used for," he paused, "for cases that require discretion." She looked at the building. "It's legitimate," he said. "The staff are licensed. The equipment is better than Providence Medical's. He'll be safe here." She looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face and the dressed jaw and the way he was still compensating for his left side, at the quality of his certainty when he said safe here, which was not the certainty of someone making a promise he couldn't keep. "Okay," she said. They got out of the vehicle. Isaiah was already being helped out of the third car by the medic, and when he saw the facility, he looked at Zuri with an expression of interrogation, and she gave him the small nod that had been their shorthand since they were children, the one that meant, "I'll explain later. Trust me now." He trusted her. He always had. She walked beside him toward the entrance, and Tae-jin was 3 steps behind them, and Min-jae was on his phone coordinating the aftermath of an evening that would require days to fully account for. And somewhere in the Port District, a man named Kwon Jin-hyuk was being processed toward the worst night of his life. And somewhere else in the city park, Dae-jung was running from the clock that was already counting down to when running stopped being possible. But right now, in this moment,
Isaiah's shoulder was under her hand, and she could feel him walking, feel the specific rhythm of his steps, feel him alive and present and intact in the way that made everything else secondary. They were almost at the entrance when Isaiah spoke, quietly, aimed at the middle distance. "The man behind us," he said. "He's the one whose house you work in." "Yes," she said. A pause. 3 more steps. "He came himself," Isaiah said. She didn't answer immediately. She had been thinking about this in the car, the specific fact of it, not abstractly but concretely, the fact that Tae-jin had not sent his team and remained at the mansion. He had been in Building 3. He had been standing 4 feet from Kwon Jin-hyuk with a cut on his jaw and a compensating tilt to his left side, and he had been there himself. "Yes," she said. "He did." Isaiah nodded slowly, with the look of someone filing important information. Then the entrance doors opened, and the warmth of the interior came out to meet them, and Zuri walked her brother through the door and into the light. And for the first time since 2:14 in the morning of the previous day, she felt the specific quality of a breath that reached the bottom of her lungs. Behind her, Tae-jin stopped at the threshold. She turned. I was standing in the doorway, one hand braced on the frame, not for support, or not primarily for support, but the posture of someone who has reached the edge of a space and is considering whether what's inside it is somewhere they are permitted to enter. She looked at him. She stepped back through the doorway to where he was standing. "Come inside," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of everything that look had accumulated over 9 months. The maid on the floor, the ointment, the panic room, the table in the warehouse with 8 stitches, and a question about a boy named Seo Tae-jin. And then he came inside, and the door closed behind them both, and in the corridor ahead of them, Isaiah was already 20 feet down, and telling the intake nurse something that was making her laugh, and the sound of it reached them where they stood. And it was the most ordinary sound Zuri had heard in 36 hours, and it was the best sound she had ever heard in her life. Tae-jin stood beside her and listened to it. His hand found hers. Not deliberately, or not only deliberately, more the motion of someone who has spent a very long time choosing not to reach for things, and has temporarily run out of the energy required to maintain that choice. She didn't move away. She looked at Isaiah down the corridor, animated and irritating the intake nurse in the particular way that meant he was genuinely fine, and she stood in the doorway of a building she'd never been inside with the most dangerous man she'd ever known holding her hand in a corridor, and somewhere behind all of it, underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the 36 hours that had dismantled every careful boundary she'd constructed, was the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. She would find one. But not tonight. Tonight there was Isaiah's voice down the corridor and the warmth after cold and Tae-jin's hand around hers and the specific, earned, unglamorous relief of a situation that had come as close as it was going to come and had not taken the thing she loved most. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow would require everything else. The first thing Zuri did the next morning was sit in a chair beside Isaiah's bed and watch him sleep. Not anxiously. Not with the monitoring quality of the previous 2 years, the constant calibration of breath rate and color, and the specific position of his hands that told her things his words didn't. She sat and watched him the way you watch something you almost lost, which is different, quieter, less clinical, more like gratitude with nowhere particular to go. The room was better than room 414 at Providence. The equipment was newer. The light came in at a different angle. Isaiah slept deeply, the real sleep of someone whose body had finally been given what it needed after a very long time of making do with less. And his face in sleep had the particular quality she had been watching for 19 years. The specific loosening that happened when he stopped managing things. He had been managing things since he was 12. Since their mother got sick the first time, and Zuri had been old enough to handle the external logistics, and Isaiah had been old enough to understand what the logistics were covering for. He had learned management young and had never entirely stopped. She sat for an hour. A nurse came in at 7 to check the overnight readings, and Zuri asked questions until she was satisfied, and then she went to find coffee, which was in a small staff break room down the corridor. She stood at the window with a cup she'd poured from a machine that produced something that approximated coffee without fully committing to it, and looked at the Seattle morning, which was gray and damp and entirely indifferent to the previous 36 hours. She thought about what came next. The shape of next was not clear.
It had the general outline of a decision she needed to make, but not the specific features yet. She could see the edges of it, but the interior was still forming. She had been inside the mansion for 9 months on the logic of a salary and a brother who needed treatment and a debt that had needed paying. 2 of those 3 things had changed. The debt was gone. The treatment was funded. The salary was, she didn't know what the salary was. She didn't know what her employment status was. She didn't know what any of her status was. In the specific organizational sense, inside the world she had been peripheral to for 9 months and had, over the course of the last 2 days, moved considerably closer to the center of. She drank the approximated coffee and thought about Tae-jin's hand around hers in the doorway. She thought about what it meant to choose something rather than being chosen by it. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang. Unknown number, which had meant something different 12 hours ago than it meant now, but her stomach still tightened before she answered. It was not a threatening voice on the other end. It was a man from the Federal Financial Crimes Division, politely requesting that she come in for a conversation at her earliest convenience in connection with an ongoing investigation into the Kwan Syndicate's Port Authority operations. He used words like voluntary and preliminary, and at your convenience in the practice sequence of someone who knew that voluntary and at your convenience were frameworks rather than descriptions. She told him she'd call back to schedule and ended the call. She stood at the window for another moment. Then she called Tae-jin. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake. Federal Financial Crimes, she said. They want a conversation. A brief silence. I know. I received a similar call 40 minutes ago. His voice had the quality of the morning after. Not diminished, but recalibrated. The operational urgency of the previous night compressed back into the register of someone assessing a situation rather than moving through it at speed. They'll be professional. They want the Kwan organization, not collateral. You don't need to say anything you don't want to say. I know what I don't need to say, she said. I know you do. A pause. Isaiah. He slept well. He's still sleeping. Good. Another pause, slightly longer, with a quality to it that was different from operational processing. Are you all right? She considered the question seriously. It deserved serious consideration. I'm drinking something that's trying very hard to be coffee, she said. I slept in a chair. My legs hurt. Yes, I think I'm all right. There's a conversation we need to have, he said. When you're ready. I know, she said. Not today. Not today, he agreed. She went back to Isaiah's room and sat in the chair until he woke up. He woke the way he always woke in hospitals. Not gradually, but all at once. The specific transition of someone who had learned to come back to consciousness with their bearings already assembled. Because disorientation in a hospital setting was a luxury his particular situation had not always afforded. He looked at the room, looked at her. Still here, he said. Obviously, she said. He looked at the ceiling. Did the inventory she recognized, his own inventory, the body check he'd been running every morning for 2 years. She watched his face move through it, watched the small confirmation that things were where they were supposed to be. Better, he said, meaning the room, meaning the equipment, meaning the quality of the sleep, meaning several things at once. Good, she said. He turned his head to look at her directly. Isaiah's gaze had always been too direct for casual use. He deployed it intentionally when he wanted to actually say something, and right now it was fully deployed. Tell me everything, he said. She told him most of it, not the stitching. She would tell him that eventually, when enough time had passed that it was a story rather than a recent event. Not the specific texture of standing in Building 3 in the doorway and watching Tae-jin 4 feet from Kwan Jin-hyuk. Not the hand in the corridor doorway, the scaffolding of it, Cormac's debt and Tae-jin's phone call, and what Tae-jin had built in 3 cities, and how she had come to be present when it mattered. Enough that Isaiah could see the shape of what he'd been moved through and why. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she valued most about him. He had learned to listen with his whole attention, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to mean he was processing rather than formulating. He paid for the treatment, Isaiah said, before any of this. He just paid for it. Yes. Without telling you. Without telling me. Isaiah looked at the ceiling again.
And now? She looked at her hands. The knuckles were better. The ointment was working. I don't know yet. Zuri? I genuinely don't know yet, Isaiah. Do you want to know? She thought about this. About the envelope in Tae-jin's desk with the identity documents and the $250,000. About the private plane that had been ready. About standing in the east corridor with her cleaning supplies and the phone still warm in her hand and looking at the closed office door and knowing something had shifted that was not going to shift back. Yes, she said. I want to know. Isaiah nodded slowly. Then, is he good to you? The question landed the way his direct questions always landed, square, without decoration, in exactly the place it was aimed. She thought about the ointment, about the panic room and walked me through every stitch, about he came himself, about the specific quality of a man who had spent 35 years building an empire from fear, telling her that her crying bothered him and that he didn't know why, which was the most honest thing she had ever heard from someone in his position and possibly from anyone. He's honest, she said. That's not the same as good. But I think in his case it might be the place good starts. Isaiah absorbed this, filed it in the place he filed things he intended to return to. Okay, he said. Okay? She repeated. You've been taking care of me for a long time, he said. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the first thing that's just yours. She looked at her brother's face, at the exhaustion still there behind the morning clarity, at the bruise on his temple that was deepening toward purple, at the 19 years of him that she had been watching and worrying over and running logistics for, and felt the specific weight of love that had never been light, but had never, not once, felt like a burden she wanted to set down. Get some rest, she said. I just woke up. Rest anyway. He rested. The federal conversation happened 4 days later in a building downtown with the specific interior design of institutions that wanted to project competence without ostentation. The investigator was a woman in her 40s named Reyes, with the manner of someone who had been conducting these conversations long enough to have shed the performative aspects of them. She was direct and professional, and she asked Zuri things she could answer and a few things she couldn't, and Zuri answered the ones she could in full and said, I don't know to the ones she couldn't in the specific honest way that was different from I won't say. And Reyes was experienced enough to know the difference. Tae-jin had his own conversation with a different investigator on the same day. She didn't know exactly what was said. She knew that the Kwon Syndicate's financial documentation had arrived at the right offices in the right sequence, and that 3 of Kwon Jin-hyuk's senior people had been arrested within 48 hours of the warehouse, and that Kwon himself was in federal custody, awaiting a proceedings calendar that would occupy several years of everyone's professional attention. She knew that Park Dae-jung had been located, not by federal investigators, and not through channels she was going to examine too closely, and that he would not be running anyone's security analysis in the foreseeable future. She knew that Cormac Rourke had not reappeared in Seattle, and that his loan operation had been quietly dismantled by people who had an interest in tidying it. She knew all of this the way you know the weather after a storm has passed, by the specific quality of the air afterward, the things that were no longer there, the particular silence where the pressure had been. 3 weeks after the warehouse, she went back to the mansion, not as staff. She was clear about this with herself in the car on the way there, so that she arrived clear rather than in the process of clarifying. She was not going back to clean floors or change orchids or manage PAC's printed guidelines. She was going back because Tae-jin had said there's a conversation we need to have, and she had said not today, and she was done waiting for the right day to arrive on its own. PAC met her at the entrance. He looked at her with his clipboard and his expression, and she waited for the brace for impact face, and what she got instead was what she'd gotten the morning after the attack. Something different, something that had replaced the expression she'd cataloged without her noticing when it changed. He stepped aside and let her through. The mansion looked the same. This was slightly surprising. She had half expected it to look different, the way places look different after significant events. But the entrance hall had its orchids, and the corridor had its lighting, and the east wing was the east wing. She had cleaned this place twice a week for 9 months, and knew it the way she knew her own face, and it received her with the indifference of a place that didn't track the weight of the things that happened inside it. She went to the east wing office. The door was open. Tae-jin was at his desk. He was working, phone against his shoulder,
papers in front of him, the specific focused posture of someone managing several things simultaneously. He saw her in the doorway and held up a single finger, which she understood as one moment, and she stood in the doorway and waited while he finished the call and set the phone down and looked at her. "You didn't knock," he said. "The door was open," she said. "I left it open." She walked in and sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair she'd sat in 9 months ago when he'd given her the ointment and told her he didn't want blood on his floors. The chair she'd never sat in voluntarily before that. She sat in it now like she'd been sitting in it for years. Tae-jin looked at her. The cut on his jaw had healed to a thin line. His shoulder, she had asked the medic the previous week and been told the stitches had held and the wound was closing cleanly, which she had received with more relief than she'd anticipated feeling about something she'd done under those circumstances. "Isaiah," he said. "His last blood work came back better than the previous cycle," she said. "His doctor said the improvement is consistent with the treatment trajectory." She said. She stopped. The specific words the doctor had used were precise and clinical, and Zuri had written them down on a piece of paper she'd been carrying in her jacket pocket for 4 days. She didn't need to take it out. She said she's cautiously optimistic. Tae-jin absorbed this with the same quality of stillness he absorbed most things, but something behind his eyes moved. "Good," he said. Just the one word, and in it was everything she'd come to understand about how he used language, precisely, without surplus, so that when something mattered, it didn't get diluted. She looked at the desk. At the corner of it, she could see the edge of an envelope. She knew which envelope it was. She had worked in this room twice a week for 9 months. She knew where he kept things. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." The foundation. She had learned about it 3 days ago from Delphine, who had learned about it from Minjae, which was the information ecosystem of the mansion operating as it always had. A medical foundation, newly established, funding experimental treatment protocols for families without the financial architecture to access them. Anonymously administered, quietly capitalized. "That was you." A pause. "Yes," he said. "It's not penance," she said. I'm not going to let you tell me it is." "I wasn't going to," he said, "because penance is something you do to make yourself feel better about what you've done. And you told me in the panic room that saving Isaiah didn't make the ledger feel better, so it's not penance." "No," he said, "it isn't." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the desk, then at her. "And the only thing I know how to build," he said, "is structure, systems, architecture that makes things run in a particular direction. I've been building that kind of thing since I was 17 years old, and most of what I built ran in directions I'm not going to pretend were clean." He paused. "This is a different direction, that's all." She looked at him for a long moment. "How many families?" she said. "Currently, 11. The intake process takes time. We're building the clinical relationships." 11 families, she said. 11, he confirmed. She sat with that. 11 families who were, right now, accessing something they couldn't have accessed before, because a man who had spent 20 years building an empire from fear had decided to build something else with the same hands. Not instead of, she wasn't naive, she understood that the organization still existed and would continue to exist, and that she was sitting in the office of its primary architect, but alongside. A different direction, running concurrent. She thought about what she'd said to Isaiah about honest being where good starts. "I'm not going back to housekeeping," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not your staff." "I know that too." She looked at the envelope again. "Are those still in there?" He followed her gaze. "Yes." "The documents, the money." "Yes." She stood up, walked around the desk. Tae-jin tracked her without turning, just the slight adjustment of his posture that meant he was aware of her position. She picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it, the documents inside, the financial instrument, the specific gravity of an exit she'd been offered and had refused once already. She held it for a moment, then she set it down and looked at him. "I'm not tearing these up," she said. Something moved across his face. "Because tearing them up would mean I'm staying because I have to," she said. "Because I don't have another option, or because you paid for Isaiah and I feel obligated, or because I'm afraid of what's outside the gate." She set her hand on top of the envelope. "I'm leaving them intact because I want to be able to walk out that gate anytime I choose, and I'm staying because I choose not to." Tae-jin stood. He was close enough that she could see the healed line on his jaw clearly, the specific texture of it, the slight asymmetry that meant it would be visible for a long time and possibly always. Clues enough that she understood he had stood not to create distance but to change the geometry of the conversation, to be on the same level rather than behind the desk. "The gate has always been open," he said. "It was open the first morning after the phone call. It was open during the attack. It was open in the loading area." "I know," she said. "You didn't keep me here." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him. At the whole of his face, which she had been learning for 9 months and 2 days, and a warehouse, and a panic room, and a corridor, in a private medical facility, and which she knew now well enough to read the things it didn't say, which were generally more significant than the things it did. "Seo-jun," she said. His face stilled. "You haven't talked about him since the panic room," she said. "That's fine, you don't have to, but I want you to know that I haven't forgotten him, that he's in this. In the foundation and in everything else. He's in the reason Isaiah is alive." She paused. "That matters." Tae-jin stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "He would have been 31 this year." His voice was the same register as always, controlled and even, but something underneath it had changed texture. "He was terrible at school, brilliant with numbers, completely indifferent to everything else. He could calculate a sum in his head faster than anyone I ever met." A pause. "I used to argue with him about that, about whether it was a useful skill or just a skill, whether school mattered if you were good at the thing that mattered." "Who won the argument?" she said. "Neither of us," he said. We never finished it." She understood what it cost him to say that. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had grown up running logistics for a sick person. The things you didn't get to finish had a particular weight, separate from loss itself. The specific incompleteness of interrupted things. She put her hand on his arm. Not dramatically. Just the placement of a hand on a forearm, the simplest gesture. He looked at it. Then he put his hand over hers. They stood like that in the East Wing office with the afternoon light coming in at its particular angle, and the orchids in the entrance hall, and Pack's clipboard somewhere, and the 12 people who currently worked in this house going about the machinery of it, and outside the gate Seattle moved through its gray and damp mid-afternoon, and none of it required anything of either of them for a moment. Then Tae-jin said, "I want to show you something." He took her down through the East Wing to a part of the house she had cleaned around but never been inside. A set of rooms off the main corridor, currently empty. He opened the doors and turned on the light, and she looked at the space. It was large. Windows on 2 sides. Good light, even in the gray afternoon, the kind of light that came from windows positioned with intention. The rooms connected to each other through an archway, which meant you could move between them without returning to the corridor. "The foundation needs an administrative base," he said. "Not here. The office is in the city, but the intake coordination, the case management, the family liaison work, that needs someone who understands what it means to be on the receiving end of a system that wasn't built for you. Someone who knows the difference between what a form says and what a situation actually is." She looked at the rooms, at the light. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm telling you the position exists," he said. "What you do with that information is yours." She looked at him. He was watching her with the measuring quality she had spent 9 months learning to hold without flinching, except it wasn't measuring anymore, or it was measuring, but what it was measuring had changed, had become something more personal than operational assessment. "The 11 families," she said. "Yes. I'd want full case visibility. I'm not going to be a coordinator who gets filtered information. I need to know what's actually happening with each family." "That's what I'd want from the position," he said. "I'd want to be able to say no to cases we can't serve adequately, not take everything just because we can technically process it. Also what I'd want." She looked at the rooms again. "The space needs work. I know. The light is good, though. The light is why I chose it." She turned to look at him. I was standing in the archway between the 2 rooms, and in the gray afternoon light with the position of the window behind him. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a very long series of difficult decisions and was standing in front of one more, waiting to see which way it fell. She walked to the window, looked out at the garden, which she'd passed through twice a week for 9 months and never stood in. The plants had survived the attack. The east perimeter had damage that had been repaired.
The security infrastructure had been rebuilt and reinforced, but the garden itself was intact. She could see the path that ran along the inner wall and the bench at the far end that nobody ever seemed to use. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "That night you heard me in the corridor. You said you heard me for 4 minutes before you opened the door." She turned from the window. "What were you doing in those 4 minutes?" He was quiet for a moment. "Deciding," he said. "What you were deciding. Whether to get involved." He said it directly, without defensiveness. "I was aware that opening the door was going to cost me something. I didn't know what, but I understood that a man in my position doesn't open doors to crying staff members in the middle of the night without that action meaning something, either to the person or to the organization or to himself." "And you opened it anyway," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her with the full unguarded quality she had seen in the panic room and the warehouse doorway and the medical facility corridor. "Because I was tired," he said. "Tired of the calculation. Tired of running every human impulse through a cost-benefit analysis before I let it become an action." He paused. "And because you'd been crying for 4 minutes and I didn't want to listen to it for a fifth." She looked at him for a long moment. "That might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I've been told I'm too direct." "You've been told correctly," she said. "I appreciate it anyway." He almost smiled. The almost was enough. She had learned to read the almost. She looked around the rooms one more time, thought about 11 families, thought about the cases she couldn't yet imagine, the people she hadn't met, the specific kind of work that required knowing things from the inside rather than the outside. She thought about 9 months of making herself invisible and what it had cost her. She thought about Isaiah telling her, "Don't do whatever they're asking," from inside a warehouse in the Port District, sick and cold and scared and still clear about the thing that mattered. She thought about her mother's broken watch and its pawn shop valuation, and the coffee tin with $312, and the specific arithmetic of survival that she had been running since she was 14 years old. She was done with that arithmetic. "I'll need an office of my own," she said. "Not shared space. My own." "This room," he said, gesturing to the larger of the two. "The other one for case files and support staff when we're at capacity. I want to hire the coordinator myself." "Of course. And I want to talk to the clinical team directly, not through a liaison. I want to be in those conversations." "I'll arrange it." She nodded, looked at the window and the garden and the path along the inner wall and the bench nobody used. "Isaiah is going to want to visit," she said, "when he's well enough. He's welcome here. He'll ask you questions," she said. "He's very direct." "Good," Tae-jin said. "So am I." She thought about Isaiah's face when she'd told him about the man whose house she worked in. The specific question, "Is he good to you?" The specific quality of listening he'd brought to her answer. The 19 years of him watching her manage everything for everyone and asking nothing for herself. She was going to give him something to see that was different from that. She went to the door of the room and stood in the frame. Tae-jin was still in the archway. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour, in this room. And it was good light. She'd been right about that. "I'm going to see Isaiah," she said. "He has an appointment this afternoon." "I know," he said, which meant Min Jae had coordinated the security detail, which was still in place, and which Isaiah had accepted with the pragmatic grace of someone who understood the world had recently rearranged itself, and some temporary adjustments were the reasonable price of that. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "We can talk about the case management structure." "I'll have the clinical contact information ready," he said. She looked at him one more time, at the man in the archway with the healed jaw and the honest eyes, and the empire built from fear that he was, slowly and with evident difficulty, trying to build alongside a different kind of thing. Not instead of, she was never going to pretend the world was simpler than it was, but alongside. "Tae-jin," she said. He looked at her. "The bench in the garden," she said. "Does anyone use it?" He looked slightly puzzled by the question. "No." "We should use it," she said, "when there's time." He looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face that was not the almost smile and was not the measuring quality and was not the controlled professional register. It was something quieter than all of those things. Something she didn't have a name for yet and didn't need one. "When there's time," he said. She left through the East Wing corridor and through the entrance hall past the orchids and out through the staff entrance,
which she supposed she would stop calling the staff entrance now and across the parking area to the street. She took the bus to the hospital. She sat in the back and looked out the window at Seattle moving past in its gray, ordinary way. And she thought about the foundation and the rooms with good light and 11 families she hadn't met yet. And she thought about Isaiah walking in the garden she'd seen from the window when he was well enough to walk gardens, which would be soon, the doctor had said cautiously. Optimistic and cautiously optimistic was the most valuable currency she knew. She thought about the bench nobody used. She thought about a man who had heard someone crying for 4 minutes and had been tired enough of his own calculation to open the door, and what that single action had cost him, and what it had given her, and how the distance between those two things was the whole of the last 9 months. She got off at the hospital stop and walked through the entrance and down the corridor to the room where Isaiah was sitting up in bed with his phone in his hand, looking considerably better than he had 3 weeks ago, which was the most specific indicator she had. He looked up when she walked in. "You look different," he said. "I'm the same," she said. "No." He looked at her with his direct eyes, the full deployment. "You look like you made a decision." She sat down in the chair beside his bed. "I made several." "Good ones?" She looked at her hands. The knuckles were healed. The ridge of scar tissue on her right index finger was still there and would probably always be there, the physical record of 9 months of work and bleach and cold water. She had stopped minding it. "I think so," she said. "Ask me in a year." Isaiah looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at his phone, and she recognized the quality of looking back at the phone, which was the gesture he made when something had landed and he was giving her space around it rather than pressing it. He had learned that from her. She had learned it from necessity. He had learned it from watching her, which was its own kind of thing. She sat with him while the afternoon moved through its hours and the light changed in the room and the monitor did its steady, uncomplicated work, and a nurse came in and checked the readings and made notes and left. And outside the window, Seattle continued its gray and damp existence. And inside the room, there was the particular quality of peace that came not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of someone you trusted beside you. "The bench," Isaiah said, out of nowhere. She looked at him. "What?" "You mentioned a bench once, months ago, said there was a bench in a garden that nobody used." He was still looking at his phone. "You remember that?" She thought about it. She couldn't remember when she would have mentioned it. She must have said something in passing, one of the many conversations she'd had with Isaiah on buses and in hospital break rooms and on the phone at 3 in the morning. "Vaguely," she said. "I want to sit on a bench in a garden," he said. "When I'm out of here, I want that. Something simple." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. He looked up. "I know a bench," she said. "Nobody uses it. We could fix that." Isaiah looked at her with the direct eyes and the 19 years, and the quality of someone who had been managing his understanding of the world his entire life and was very good at reading its actual geography, regardless of what the map said. "Okay," he said. Outside, the light was doing what it did at this hour. Not disappearing, just changing register, the specific shift of a Seattle afternoon into early evening that was less about darkness and more about depth. The sky going from flat gray to something with more dimension in it. Zuri sat in the chair beside her brother's bed. She had spent 9 months making herself invisible inside a house that belonged to someone else. She had spent 2 years before that making herself functional inside a situation that would have broken most people. She had spent her whole life developing the specific competency of survival. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the quiet, ordinary, relentless kind that just kept going because the alternative wasn't acceptable. She was done with invisible. She was done with small. The woman who had dropped a cleaning bottle in a corridor 9 months ago and covered her mouth to keep the sound inside had not disappeared. She was still there, in the hands that had learned to hold a needle, and in the eyes that had learned to hold Tae-jin's gaze, and in the voice that had said, "I'm staying with no plan, and no guarantee, and nothing but the refusal to keep running." That woman had simply found out what she was made of. It turned out she was made of more than she'd thought. Isaiah reached over without looking up from his phone and put his hand on her arm briefly, the way he'd been doing since he was 7 years old, and understood that sometimes you just needed someone to register that you were there. Then he went back to his phone. She looked at the window. Tomorrow there were rooms with good light waiting for her. Tomorrow there were 11 families and a clinical team and a coordinator to hire and a case management structure to build from the ground up. Tomorrow, Tae-jin would have the contact information ready, and they would sit in those rooms and start the work of building something that ran in a different direction. Tomorrow was going to require a great deal. But tonight, Isaiah was in the chair beside her with color in his face and his doctors cautiously optimistic in her pocket, and the bench in the garden waiting for when he was well enough to need it. Tonight was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had been running toward for 2 years without knowing that was what she was doing, through debt and bleach and cold water and corridors and panic rooms and a voice on a phone that had changed everything in 11 seconds flat. She had arrived. She sat in the chair and let herself stay there. And outside Seattle went about its evening, and inside the room the monitor kept its steady rhythm, and somewhere across the city in a house on a cliffside with good orchids and a garden nobody used, a man was sitting at a desk deciding what to build next. She would help him decide. That was a choice she was making freely, with the documents intact in the envelope and the gate open and the full knowledge of who he was and what his world contained. She was staying because she chose to. She looked at Isaiah. He looked up, as if sensing it, met her eyes.